Now, they're the first breeding population of beavers in the English countryside in hundreds of...
On the morning of August 14, 1948, a twin-engine Beechcraft lifted off from an airfield near McCall, Idaho, carrying a pilot, a wildlife officer, and 8 wooden crates, each one holding a very confused beaver. Over the following days, 76 beavers would be pushed out of that same aircraft, one crate at a time, each rigged with a military surplus parachute, and dropped from roughly 500 feet directly into one of the most remote wilderness basins in the American West. It remains, to this day, one of the strangest wildlife relocation programs ever attempted, and 77 years later, its consequences are still visibly shaping the landscape those beavers landed in. Before we get into how that happened, if you're into real, deeply researched nature stories like this one, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe now so you don't miss the next one. To understand why anyone thought parachuting beavers out of an airplane was a reasonable idea, you have to understand the very specific, very frustrating problem Idaho's Department of Fish and Game was facing in the years right after World War II. As soldiers returned home and the post-war housing boom pushed new development into rural areas around McCall and Payette Lake, newly arrived residents found themselves in direct conflict with an animal that had been living there long before any of them showed up. Beavers were flooding orchards, damaging culverts, and felling ornamental and commercial timber, doing exactly what beavers do, just now in places filled with people who did not want it done. Wildlife officials faced growing pressure to remove the animals, but killing them outright ran against a conservation ethic the department was actively trying to build. The obvious alternative was relocation, moving the so-called nuisance beavers somewhere far from people, ideally somewhere that could actually benefit from having them. That somewhere already existed. The Chamberlain Basin, a remote, high-elevation expanse of meadows and streams deep in central Idaho, had almost no beaver population at all, despite being exactly the kind of habitat beavers thrive in. It was also, critically, almost entirely without roads, part of what is now the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, the largest contiguous roadless forest area in the lower 48 states. Getting a truckload of beavers into a landscape like that meant switching to pack animals for the final leg of any journey, and that was where the whole relocation program started falling apart before it even got started. Idaho Fish and Game's original method involved crating live beavers and strapping those crates onto mules for the trip into the backcountry. It went badly almost every time. Beavers, hauled for hours through summer heat in enclosed wooden boxes, frequently overheated, became too stressed to eat, and in a number of documented cases, simply died before ever reaching their release site. The mules were not much happier about the arrangement either, growing skittish and difficult to manage once they realized exactly what was thrashing around and smelling up the boxes on their backs. Wildlife Officer Elmo Heder, based out of the McCall office, later described the whole process in blunt terms in his own official write-up. Repeated handling, he wrote, involved considerable losses of beavers. Heder needed a faster method, one that avoided the multi-day mule trek entirely, and the era he was working in happened to offer an unusual solution. The world had just come out of a war defined partly by the mass aerial delivery of troops and supplies, and military surplus parachutes were, as a direct result, cheap and widely available across the country. If the Army could drop soldiers and equipment into difficult terrain by air, Heder reasoned, there was no obvious reason the same basic principle could not work for a 50-pound rodent. The engineering problem took real trial and error to solve. Heder needed a container that would protect a beaver during the fall, hold securely shut throughout the descent so the animal could not fall or jump out early, and then pop open automatically the instant it touched the ground, without requiring anyone to hike in and manually release the occupant. His eventual design used 2 hinged wooden compartments joined at the base, held shut by the parachute's own tension during the drop, and released the moment the tension relaxed on landing. Before trusting the design to actual relocation candidates, Heder tested it repeatedly using an older male beaver the team had nicknamed Geronimo, dropping him again and again from a flying field to fine-tune both the box design and the ideal release altitude. Geronimo, according to Heder's own account, handled the process with a level of patience that bordered on the absurd. Dropped, boxed, and parachuted from heights around 150 to 200 meters, over and over, the old beaver would simply climb back into his box once handlers approached to reset for the next test run, seemingly unbothered by the entire ordeal. Once Heder felt confident in the final design, Geronimo earned the distinction of leading the very first operational drop, parachuted into the Chamberlain Basin alongside 3 female beavers as the opening group of what would become a much larger relocation effort. The full operation that followed, dubbed Operation High Dive by the people running it, was not entirely without incident. During one of the earliest drops, a lashing securing one of the crates broke partway through the descent, and the beaver inside worked his way out through the gap, climbing on top of his own falling box midair. Heder later wrote that had the animal simply stayed put, everything would have gone fine. Instead, the beaver jumped from a height of roughly 75 feet, becoming the operation's only fatality. Of the 76 beavers ultimately dropped into the Chamberlain Basin that August, 75 reached the ground alive and, within moments of their crates springing open, immediately began doing what beavers do, exploring their new streams, felling nearby saplings, and, before long, building dams. Heder's own write-up also documents a detail about beaver behavior during the drops that later handlers found almost as remarkable as the parachutes themselves. The animals appeared to experience very little lasting distress from the process. Once a crate's compartment sprang open on landing, most beavers emerged within moments, sniffed briefly at their surroundings, and moved directly toward the nearest water source, behaving, by every observable measure, like an animal that had simply arrived somewhere new, rather than one that had just been dropped from several hundred feet in the air. Wildlife officers monitoring the release sites in the days and weeks that followed reported finding fresh cuttings and early dam construction at several drop locations remarkably quickly. Evidence that the relocated beavers were settling into their new territory and beginning to build almost immediately, rather than needing an extended recovery period after the unconventional journey. The funding behind the entire operation traces back to a piece of federal legislation most Americans have never heard of, but that has quietly shaped American wildlife conservation for nearly a century. The Pittman-Robertson Wildlife Restoration Act, passed by Congress in 1937, directs revenue from a federal excise tax on firearms, ammunition, and hunting equipment directly towards state wildlife conservation programs, effectively funding habitat restoration and species management projects through a tax paid almost entirely by hunters and sport shooters. Idaho's beaver relocation efforts, including the 1948 parachute program, drew on exactly this funding stream, part of a broader set of Pittman-Robertson-backed beaver transplant initiatives the state had been running since the late 1930s, using more conventional truck and mule-based methods, before Heder's aerial approach replaced them for the hardest-to-reach release sites. The cost breakdown reflected in Heder's own report undercut any assumption that this method was some kind of expensive publicity stunt. Delivered by parachute, the total cost worked out to roughly $16 per beaver, cheaper and dramatically less deadly than the mule packing method it replaced. Heder's official write-up, published in April of 1950 in the Journal of Wildlife Management under the fittingly dry title Transplanting Beaver by Airplane and Parachute, concluded that the approach had proven both more humane and more cost-effective than any alternative the department had previously tried. Closing the book on what remains, even decades later, one of the more unusual entries in the history of American wildlife management. The most surprising part of this story, though, is not the parachutes at all. It is what happened afterward, and how long that impact has lasted. Wildlife officers marked each relocated beaver with an ear tag before release, and in the years that followed, at least one tagged animal was recovered roughly 100 miles from the original drop site. Evidence of just how far and how quickly beavers can disperse and establish new territory once given suitable habitat and left alone. Left almost entirely undisturbed in a roadless wilderness with no natural predators pursuing them at any real scale, the Chamberlain Basin's new beaver population began doing exactly what wildlife officials had hoped: building dams, creating ponds, and slowly converting stretches of open stream into the kind of complex wetland habitat the basin had never supported before. It helps to understand exactly why Idaho Fish and Game wanted beavers in the Chamberlain Basin in the first place, rather than simply viewing the relocation as a way to dump an unwanted animal somewhere out of sight. Beavers are what ecologists now call ecosystem engineers, a species capable of physically reshaping the landscape it inhabits far beyond what its own size would suggest. A single dam slows the flow of a stream, forcing water sideways into the surrounding floodplain rather than letting it rush downstream unchecked. Over time, a healthy beaver population can transform a narrow, fast-moving creek into a complex network of ponds and wetlands, raising the local water table, reducing erosion, and creating habitat for fish, amphibians, waterfowl, and countless other species that a simple, undammed stream could never support on its own. Heder and his colleagues understood this dynamic well enough, even without the more formal ecological vocabulary researchers use today, to recognize that beavers dropped into the right high-elevation basin would not just survive there, they would actively improve the terrain around them, turning dry meadows into the kind of water-retentive wetland habitat that benefits elk, birds, and the basin's broader wildlife community for decades to come. Idaho fish and game officials today are candid that they cannot say with scientific certainty whether the beavers now living in the Frank Church wilderness are the direct genetic descendants of Geronimo and his 75 companions. Genetic testing did not exist as a practical field tool in 1948, and no tissue samples from the original animals survive for comparison against the modern population. It remains entirely possible that some, or even most of today's Chamberlain Basin beavers arrived through natural dispersal from other populations over the following decades, rather than descending directly from the parachuted founders. What is not in question is the underlying ecological transformation. Beaver populations across Idaho's major river systems have remained stable for decades since, and the wetlands, dams, and altered stream patterns their engineering produces continue reshaping watersheds throughout the region to this day. Idaho's 1948 program was not the only time American wildlife agencies tried moving animals by parachute, though it remains by far the most famous. Similar aerial relocation techniques were tested elsewhere in the country during the mid-20th century for other hard-to-transport species, generally driven by the same basic logic. Certain animals simply could not survive the stress of a long overland journey by truck or pack animal, and if military surplus parachute equipment happened to be cheap and abundant in the years right after World War II, wildlife agencies were willing to experiment with genuinely unconventional solutions rather than default to killing nuisance animals outright. Few of those other efforts, however, produced anything close to the kind of durable cultural legacy the Idaho beaver drop eventually did, likely because no other species involved offered quite the same combination of an inherently absurd visual, a patient, cooperative test subject in Geronimo, and a documented decades-long ecological payoff that people could actually go visit and see for themselves in the wilderness today. That engineering effect has proven measurable well beyond the original 1948 drop zone. At Baugh Creek, a separate Idaho waterway unrelated to the Chamberlain Basin release, researchers studying the aftermath of a 2018 wildfire found that vegetation along stretches of the creek with active beaver dams remained noticeably greener than surrounding areas, even as fire swept through the region. Satellite imagery later confirming wider corridors of surviving plant growth, specifically where beaver-built ponds had kept the local water table elevated. It is a vivid, present-day illustration of exactly the kind of ecological resilience Heder's original 1948 program was betting on, even if nobody at the time could have predicted wildfire recovery, specifically as one of the eventual payoffs. Modern beaver relocation programs elsewhere in the American West have since drawn direct inspiration from the underlying insight Heder's team stumbled onto in 1948, even if nobody today straps a beaver to a parachute anymore. In Nevada, Washington, Oregon, and several other states, wildlife agencies routinely relocate so-called nuisance beavers, animals causing conflict on private or agricultural land, into degraded stream systems specifically chosen because they need exactly the kind of dam-building, water-retaining engineering beavers provide for free. Modern transport methods rely on ground vehicles and helicopters rather than parachutes, and the animals travel in specially designed, climate-controlled crates rather than Heder's hinged wooden boxes, but the core logic tracing directly back to Idaho's post-war program remains essentially unchanged. Rather than treating a beaver causing problems in one location as a pest to be eliminated, treat it as a mobile ecosystem restoration tool, and simply move it somewhere that restoration is actually needed. The story itself very nearly vanished from public memory entirely. For decades, the 1948 beaver drop existed mostly as an odd footnote buried in old department archives until 2014, when Idaho fish and game historian Sharon Clark received a call from a state archivist who had rediscovered original film footage of the operation, beavers visibly parachuting out of the sky that nobody at the department had realized still existed. Restored and posted online in 2015, the footage went viral, drawing national and international media attention to a program most Idahoans had never heard of. If you enjoy real, verified stories from the wild edges of nature, like this video, leave a comment letting me know what you thought and subscribe for more. I will see you in the next one.